Today's lecture covers an introduction to the November-December public forum topic, Great Power Competition. In this lecture, I'll start by analyzing the resolution, look at some foundational theories that guide the arguments on the topic, and then move on to consideration of some of the pro and con arguments. Let's start by looking at the resolution. This resolution is relatively simple and straightforward. It reads, the United States strategy of great power competition produces more benefits than harms. I'll just kind of briefly review a couple of the terms, introduce great power competition, and talk about that in more detail later. First of all, the United States. It refers to the United States, whether the United States should continue to pursue this strategy. And it kind of says, well, produces more benefits than harms. So it's that simple. Is this overall desirable? What is a strategy of great power competition? As I said, I'll break it down more later, but it generally refers to the idea that the United States should compete economically, militarily, politically with China, kind of in a battle for global military and economic and political influence. A few notes on the resolution. First of all, it doesn't say the United States should adopt a strategy of great power competition, right? It says the United States strategy of great power competition. So it's really having the affirmative defend kind of the status, defend the status quo, but also argue that it's net on balance desirable. So it seems that the presumption in this case is con. But that'll be a little bit debatable, right? The affirmative, either the pro, even though they're defending the status quo, they have to be the one that articulates why it is desirable on the net. In terms of framework arguments, there's some different ones you could consider. First of all, is this to the United States, right? In the United States, arguably kind of an America First type evaluation framework, which has become quite popular in public forum debate, is it our best interest? Kind of who cares about everyone else at the extreme? Or we could have a more cosmopolitan outlook and discuss whether or not this is beneficial to the world, given that it kind of impacts global security, war, potentially global nuclear war between great powers. It probably at least also indirectly affects everybody else. And then you can also approach it kind of from a utilitarian or deontological stance, right? The greatest good for the greatest number, or is there any ethical obligation to pursue this? We could consider values such as gender and race, are these really kind of accounted for? And when we discuss theories that would support great power competition, or are these kind of theories really and kind of policies that result from them rather sexist and racist? And of course, if you can argue critiques in your area, you can argue whether or not we should kind of securitize international relations, that we should compete with these countries, that we should view them as security threats. But even if you can't argue these arguments as critiques, because the judges are going to frown on critiques where you debate, you can still kind of use that to kind of question some of the assumptions, the security assumptions that the pro is making. Now, before we go any farther, let's look in a little bit more detail as to what great power competition is. It's really competition. It says between China and the U.S., but also between the U.S. and Russia, right? So there are three great powers in the world currently. There's the United States, China, and Russia, though its power is obviously dwindling. It is considered kind of the great power. You have maybe India rising as another. But this topic is really about the United States adopting or continuing its policy of great power competition with Russia and China. This represents a transition from post-Cold War thinking. Well, before I unpack that, let me kind of add a little bit of detail, right? After World War II, shortly after World War II, up through the kind of the late 1980s, you had what was called the Cold War between the United States and Russia. This was a period of kind of extreme hostilities where the United States also kind of fought proxy wars, like in Vietnam, in Korea. And kind of had contests in other parts of the world, in Africa, South America, where kind of interests were pitted against Russia. And though this war between the United States and Russia never directly happened, That's why it's called the Cold War. At that time, China was not really a concern. It was a little bit of a concern. China really supported North Korea. And one of the only times the U.S. considered using nuclear weapons was when the U.S. started losing in North Korea or in the Korean War, and General MacArthur requested the permission of the president to nuke China. The president of the United States declined that offer, but that was the closest we came. And China, while it had a large army and had a lot of people at the time, now right, as a population of I think of about 1.5 billion people, the United States, it really was not. We weren't really kind of in a direct competition with China. So the Cold War between the United States and Russia ended kind of in the early 1990s when Russia, which was just one part of the Soviet Union at that point, or the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, that kind of devolved because Russia really collapsed economically and collapsed politically. Russia was one of the kind of remaining countries that kind of fell from that. You also have Baltic states like Latvia, Lithuania. You had Estonia, right? You had the Ukraine, right, which was kind of part of Russia, right? So you had all these countries kind of become like their own kind of independent state. Russia held on, right? So Russia got all the nuclear weapons. Russia maintained itself as the power, okay? But it was a really like a country that kind of had fallen apart. So really, to argue other than being a nuclear threat to the United States, it was not, all right? Now, and China, its that point was still impoverished. Well, starting in 1990, China opened up its economy. That actually kind of began in like the early 1980s, the 80s, but it really started opening up, and China grew economically through trade, through technology exchanges, all these things with the West, right, including the United States. And China grew economically and has now become a leading global economic power, right? It may even surpass the United States on different economic measures. It has a population of 1.5 billion people. It has an incredibly hardworking population that's really well educated and has developed some really advanced technologies. So China has kind of merged, right, over that time. China merged as a great power, as a great economic power. Okay, in the United States, and then Russia, right? Russia started kind of putting itself back together. Putin kind of took power, really put a lot of resources in the military. Russia had become more westernized, and really until it invaded the Ukraine, and a lot of businesses pull out of Russia. But Russia kind of grew economically, so you had Russia rebound, and now obviously is a military threat, like at least in terms of its intentions, right? You can debate about how strong its military currently is, but now the United States starting to compete against these powers, and Russia is kind of referred to as a near-term threat. Obviously, it kind of invaded the Ukraine as kind of a threat to Europe. China is referred to as a pacing threat, probably more of a long-term threat. But this was a transition away from post-Cold War thinking when the post-Cold War era, the 1990s, really till up to like close to kind of 2020, was a really kind of relatively more peaceful time, at least in terms of great power conflict. And you had some more kind of stability, overall stability. Of course, there were conflicts, Iraq, Afghanistan, Russia, and Syria, right? All these things kind of going on, but it was a relatively more stable time. And you had kind of the dominance of institutions like the United Nations and more kind of collaborative approaches to problems. And then we kind of see nowadays where, the U.S. is kind of thinking about, well, gee, how are we going to compete with Russia and China? So that's why it represents a transition away from Cold War thinking. And it involves the forward deployment of kind of forces, right? Because the United States is deploying more forces to Europe, deploying more naval power into the East Asia in order to defend against China. It involves strengthening our alliances, and it involves nuclear and conventional force modernization. All these things you can be debated. Again, it doesn't have a precise term as this like piece of evidence indicates, but it generally kind of refers to competing in these realms: military, economic, technological, political power against Russia and China. What is the current U.S. strategy? How could you unpack this in even a little bit more detail? Well, you can unpack it in a little bit more detail by saying, okay, the U.S. policy is now focused on containing the expansion of Russia and China within the spheres as it is. And when the Cold War started, the U.S. had a policy of containment towards the Soviet Union, which was kind of at least articulated in concept by George Kennan, and we're kind of now back to that a little bit with Russia and China. We've decoupled, or we're trying to decouple. What does that mean? Well, I talked about in the 1990s how the global economy became more integrated. And the theory was that if you would trade with countries, then there would be this mutual economic interdependence would be created that would create an economic deterrent to conflict. The idea is that countries wouldn't want to go to war with one another, because if they did, then their economies would fracture. And this was the prevailing kind of idea for the last kind of 30 years. If you debated, like, say 20 years ago when I debated and when I did a lot of my hands-on coaching, it was really hard to beat this argument. So people said, yes, we should trade with China. They'll become more westernized. They'll become integrated into the sphere. Europe said, hey, we should trade with Russia. We should start buying all our energy from Russia, right? Germany bought a lot of it and said, oh, this will make Germany dependent on the sales of its energy to Europe, and there won't be any conflict anymore. Well, recently, we're seeing that kind of maybe even the opposite of the cases, right? Russia's like, hey, if you don't back off Europe, we're going to cut off your energy supplies. China can say, hey, the US, if you don't back off, we're going to stop sending you the rare earth minerals and the reprocessed rare earth minerals that you need in all your electronics, including your military weapons, right? Or we're not going to continue to finance your debt. So the other powers kind of, because of this trade and this quote unquote interdependence, have a lot of leverage over the United States, right? And over peers that they are competing against. So you see kind of a gradual decoupling, right? Like the United States recently passed a bill to kind of develop kind of our own, more of our semiconductor industries to try to process more of our, or not more, we're currently not processing any of our rare earth elements, right? To try to develop that technology, to try to gain access to rare earth minerals from other parts of the world where we don't have them in the United States. You see Europe trying to diversify its energy sources away from Russia, right? So they can't be blackmailed by Russia anymore in terms of energy. You see the strengthening of the Quad, which is an informal military alliance between Australia, India, Japan, and the US, which I believe was the other public forum topic that didn't win. You have the AUKUS alliance, Australia, the UK, and the US. You have NATO expansion, which some people say is what's responsible for the conflict in the Ukraine. And you see the expansion of kind of, so the physical expansion of NATO to more and more countries, and then technological cooperation between the United States and NATO in other areas, which such as artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, which is part of the 2022 NATO strategic concept. Now, considering when to, or whether or not one of these kind of a strategy of great power competition should be pursued, there are a number of things theories that you can look to guide the answer to your question. And you could use one of these theories in a framework debate, but even if you don't use them in a framework debate, you could use them to kind of guide your arguments generally, or at the very least, you're going to need to be familiar with them because other people will use them in a framework debate. And there's three approaches to international relations that I'll discuss: realism, idealism, and liberalism, which are the same, and then constructivism. So what would a realist say? A realist says that, at a deep philosophical level, people are driven by kind of the desire to improve their situation, to maximize their power. Countries being run by people kind of are driven in the same direction. To agree, a realist is going to say that as great powers rise, there's always going to be potential for conflict between those two countries. Okay, and there's different approaches to managing that, right? They're saying basically conflict in the international system is inevitable no matter what we try to do. So how can we kind of manage that or protect ourselves? And there's two different spins that, so to speak, that realists would have. An offensive realist would say that we need to do everything we can. People like Colby and Kupchin say we need to do everything we can to deter great powers. We need to develop our own militaries, project power forward to deter China in Asia and to deter Russia in Europe. Defensive realists say, well, we shouldn't forward project so much and kind of aggressively deter because that could provoke the other powers. So we need to kind of focus on more maintaining a balance of power. it's not like a specific thing, what the exact balance is, right? Sounds like a bad PF question, like, well, exactly what the balance is, how many forces you would have. It's a concept, right? So we're going to try to maintain a balance of power, and in some cases, they propose counterbalancing to have a very limited military footprint abroad, but husband resources in the United States that can project abroad if needed. So we might think to our right, and people who support this are people like John Mearshart, Waltz, right, and they're very actually critical of NATO expansion and some of the stuff that's happening in the Ukraine. The spheres of influence, Henry Kissinger. Sorry, you can't see it there a little bit over the video. Henry Kissinger, who's 90 years old, written many books on international relations, played a big role in the government in the 1960s and in the Vietnam War. Says that we got to let China have their own spheres of influence. We've got to kind of basically let them have like part of the Ukraine, because if we don't, these conflicts that are inherent in the international system, eventually what you're going to have is a great power war in the modern world. That war is going to be a nuclear war. What would a liberal say, right? Or an idealist? They'll say that liberal values will kind of eventually triumph. The liberal values of human rights, democracy, those things are going to triumph. Those are part of like who we are. All right. There was a book. All right. There was a book written called like The End of History, when Francis Fukuyama argued in the 90s we were at the end of history and democracy was spreading everywhere, and eventually humans would be fulfilled and we would have kind of global democratic peace because democracies are less likely to fight one another. Right. I mean, all that kind of turned out to be false. Kind of the realists, so to speak, in a way, were correct in that way. Right. But think about the era in which that book was written. I think, it was the late 1990s when we kind of had this euphoria. Okay, hey, we're moving to this era of kind of world peace. It was the era that I lived through most of my adulthood. Like I'm 51, right? 20 to 51 over the last 30 years. Just seemed like everything was going to be great. As many people say, hey, that's probably not something that my kids and their kids or that's probably not the world that they're going to live in. But idealists and liberals, like they recognize, obviously, it's not like just there'll be peace forever, but that we need some institutions to moderate conflict, right? Like international organizations like the United Nations, other multilateral or cooperation needs to happen in order to deal with like solving, mediating conflict, stopping like doing like collaboration on disease research, doing like and prevention, which we've seen has kind of been a struggle lately, right? Engaging in trying to prevent climate change. Okay, so so that's kind of where we are in terms of kind of their approach, right? They kind of lived in heaven in these, right, in the 90s, right, in the early 2000s. Of course, they're fearful that a return to great power competition is going to undermine these cooperative approaches, not only to security, but to combating diseases, to solving climate change, to solving other environmental problems, which obviously has its own impacts that you can argue for in the debate. What would a constructivist say? Well, a constructivist is kind of a newer theory of international relations that came up in the late 1990s, early 2000s, that really a lot of modern critiques are based on. And that kind of idea is that the way the world is kind of the way we kind of understand it and describe it. So if we see somebody as a terrorist, if we call somebody a terrorist, then we're going to interpret their actions that could potentially be negative as terroristic, right? If we see Saddam Hussein as a terrorist, then who was the disposed leader of Iraq, then everything that Saddam Hussein does that may not be great is going to be seen as kind of a terrorist action. If we talk about how threatening China is, then everything China does, we're going to see as a threat. So maybe China's buying some weapons to defend itself against Japan, right? Which, 70 years ago, right, invaded China, right? Okay, so if we won't see that. If we describe China as a threat, we'll see that as offensive rather than defensive. So these arguments, like you can use, like I say, they're kind of the foundation of modern critiques, like securitization critiques, threat construction critiques. There's an author, Pan, who applies this specifically to China. If you can, in the debate, you can use them as critiques and critique their rhetoric. But if you can't, you can use it to kind of undercut like some of the assumptions that they're making as to why China is a threat. On the pro, really we're talking about Russia and China. All right, these threats. There may be some secondary threats that I'll talk about and unpack, and some other values to adopting a strategy of great power competition, but that's the core of the debate. What are the arguments as to why China is a threat? Well, China, as I said, until around 2010, had kind of gone through this period where it was opening its up economy, modernizing. Sure, it was growing, but people didn't see it as a threat. Okay, you had a former president, Deng Xiaoping, who really kind of opened up the country. Then you had Xi take power. All right, who's the president of Xi now. All right, and we're about to have another Communist Party Congress to kind of reappoint him, extend his term. People basically say he's now the president for life, right? The elected kind of president for life. But China around 2050 will celebrate its 100th year anniversary. And some people say China really, it wants to celebrate who it is. It wants to get back all the territory that it thinks it's lost. Other people argue that China wants to take over the world and promote its own values and kind of authoritarian systems, right? And there's two different reasons why China might become a threat, right? The first one, which is kind of more an articulation of what I just talked about, that argument is made by people like Colby and kind of in a more popular form by somebody named Gertz, who argues that China is really a threat. We need to kind of like jump in there and kind of deter them as they grow economically and militarily. Someone else, Michael Beckley and Hal Brons, they make the argument that China's kind of reached the peak of its power and it's going to start declining. And when great powers start declining, they lash out and they become a threat. Obviously, you kind of can't make both of these arguments, right? But if either one is true, there's a case there for deterrence. You can say that Xi himself wants to kind of create this enormous Chinese empire, and he wants to seek kind of China's greatness and kind of reunification of countries or places, I should say. China doesn't think it's a country. China doesn't think Taiwan is a country. Taiwan thinks it is a country. The U.S. tries to play it a little bit of both ways, but they could potentially take over Taiwan. Why would they take over Taiwan? Well, China claims that Taiwan used to be kind of part of China. You can read about the history there a little bit more on the slide, or click on the link when you download the PowerPoint. All right. But in 1950, the country kind of got split when the quote unquote nationalists fled from China to Taiwan. That became the Republic of China. Then you have China, the main country up there, the big red one, right? The People's Republic of China. You can obviously see that Taiwan is a lot smaller, but it's backed by the United States, militarily, economically, by Japan, by South Korea. You can see right above South Korea, the white there between China and South Korea. That's North Korea, right? Where there's kind of really just an armistice agreement between the North and the South, and China backed South Korea China backed North Korea in the Korean War, right? As I said earlier, General MacArthur wanted to use nuclear weapons against China. So you have these countries that are kind of more democratic in the United States: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. We have a big base in Okinawa. We have military support there in the Philippines, kind of trying to defend Taiwan against China. But some people say that and there's a big debate about this, and you'll see evidence in the file both ways as to whether or not China will attack Taiwan, and whether the United States needs to pursue a strategy of great power competition in order to prevent that. Now, additionally, what additional China rivalries? There's a big kind of rivalry in technology, and especially now as the internet spread and everyone's collecting data and using data and taking advantage of data. Which technology networks are people going to end up on? Many of you probably use TikTok. Okay, TikTok is a product of a Chinese company. So whenever you use TikTok, all the data, everything they collect about you. How do they collect about you? Well, your location services are probably turned on. They can also see who your friends are based on how you interact. They can see what your interests are based on the type of videos you watch and the type of videos that you post. They're able to gather an enormous amount of information about you. All that information is stored on servers in China. And under 2017 law, the Chinese government can access any information from any company in China. So if the government wants to get all the information about you in a simple way, they can. Okay, so there's competitions of technology in terms of information. There's competition in terms of technology in terms of kind of what what technologies, advanced artificial intelligence technologies, can we use these in the military, supercomputers, semiconductors, all these types of things, okay? And some people say that, hey, if this technology really becomes advanced, all this surveillance technology, China can use it, all right, to establish, strengthen the authoritarian government in China and strengthen authoritarian power like around the world. And then, of course, there's potential for cyber conflict between usually when you're talking about Russia and cyber conflict, right, we're talking about Russia like attacking trying to threaten the U.S.'s trying to threaten the U.S. servers, so to speak, right? Like threaten. So today, all right, when I woke up this morning, right, I saw that Russia, quote unquote like hacker group tried to shut down the airline systems. All they were really able to do was kind of wipe out like the information the customers see. It didn't disrupt operations, but that's what they were attempting to do. They took over like the Colonial Pipeline and made it more difficult to transmit energy. They tried to do that previously, right? China's not, at least from what we've seen, so not really doing that, but they're trying to steal technology secrets from industry. They're trying to penetrate government networks, so there are cyber threats. Both of these combined kind of threaten what's called the liberal international order. What is the liberal international order? You're going to hear this term a lot. The liberal international order refers to that post-World War II era where the United States promoted a world, all right, a westernized world that was kind of multilateral, right? We had the United Nations. It was based in New York. We had Western Europe. We tried to support free market economies, global democracy. We project power all around the world. So, hey, Japan doesn't attack China again. So North Korea doesn't invade South Korea. So China doesn't invade Taiwan. So Russia doesn't invade Europe, okay? So Iran doesn't attack Saudi Arabia. It sounds like we're just a bunch of nice people. We're really not so much. If all those parts of the world kind of, so to speak, go to hell in a handbasket, then that's going to really disrupt the global economy. That's going to disrupt the U.S. economy. That's going to disrupt U.S. access to resources. It's going to disrupt access to some resources that we don't have at home. It's going to undermine ability to access products more cheaply. It's going to undermine our ability to access energy. So we kind of help stabilize, right, this liberal international order, and now it's under threat. One of the fundamental beliefs and cornerstones of the international order was a norm, right, that was reinforced by international law, and international law can only be kind of supported like as a norm and sustained by a certain military power, that you don't just invade another country and take their land. So when Iraq invaded Saudi Arabia, the U.S. said, get out, and we kind of forced them out of Saudi Arabia. Now Russia is just like a straight land grab, right? They're trying to go into the Ukraine, take the Ukraine back. We have China maybe going into, potentially going to Taiwan, right, to China take over Taiwan. This is really how the world existed prior to World War II, especially prior to World War I. Countries would just regularly invade one another and try to take over their territory. Well, this created a terribly unstable, dangerous world, right? So post the World War II, the United States has really enforced this liberal international order. And arguably, if the United States had to pursue a strategy of great power competition to check Russia and China, who are maybe don't kind of believe in these norms and these international laws and protections of territorial sovereignty, though China's come out recently more and said that they are, then we could have serious problems. We also kind of have what's called the Thucydides trap, which is the idea that in history, as great powers rise and other great powers fall, there tends to be war between great powers. It doesn't happen every time, but the one author says it's happened like four of the six major power transitions. Well, now if you have a major power transition, wars between great powers, there's a good chance you're going to go nuclear, and the whole planet's going to blow up, right? So there's a difference in like consideration of kind of what. To try to prevent this. How are we going to prevent this? Well, the realists are debating amongst themselves, right? Do we want to have great power competition? Do we want to have some more balancing, right? You have the liberal idealists coming in and saying, hey, this is the wrong approach entirely. What we need to do is we just need to have more multilateral cooperation, more organizations. And the constructivists are saying, hey, because you guys keep talking about this and making a big deal and keep describing Russia and China as threats, that's what's inevitably going to lead to this great power war. But let's move on and talk about the Russia threat. This is something that's in the news every day and is kind of a little bit easier to understand, right? Russia has invaded the Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. We know they're a threat to the Ukraine. We know they want to take it over. How much of that, how much of a broader threat are they, right? Well, you can debate about whether or not they're going to use tactical nuclear weapons, okay, in the Ukraine if the U.S. pushes and tries to contain Russia there, or if the U.S. just lets them have it. There are arguments on both sides. There's arguments if we push too hard and continue to pursue the strategy of great power competition with the Ukraine as a proxy, that Russia will use tactical nuclear weapons. There's other evidence that says if we back down, the rest of the people in the world are going to say, hey, the U.S. isn't, when push comes to shove, isn't really going to do anything. So North Korea is going to invade South Korea, China's going to invade Taiwan, Iran's going to invade Saudi Arabia. It's a real kind of a mess, basically, so to speak. But it's a debate. Does Russia threaten other parts of Europe? Does it want to take back those Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, that used to be part of the USSR? There's a debate there. Does it have the conventional military capability at the moment? Probably not. Russia's getting beat up on pretty badly by the Ukraine using second and third rate US and NATO weapons. If the Russians tried to fight the U.S. in a conventional battle right now, they in NATO they would get destroyed. I mean, they might be able to just keep lobbing missiles into like population centers and killing like millions of civilians, but there's no way they can win like a military to military battle against a westernized, coordinated army, air force. And they can't even knock the Ukrainian air force out of the sky, right? How are they going to kind of deal with NATO? So you can debate that. Obviously, there's earlier evidence, even from earlier in 22, that says there's more of a threat. The last couple months, it said it's collapsed. But look, they do have a huge person power advantage. They had 300,000 troops, even if they're mostly just cannon fodder, right? Like, say for every one Ukrainian that's killed, 50 Russians are killed. Well, if we got 300,000 more people stepping up to battle, it might make a big difference. So you can debate that. There are, of course, kind of some theories behind this, right? Some people, you could have some people just think Putin's crazy, right? Imagine someone that's like, quote unquote, crazy or a little unhinged. We see unhinged people walk into schools and shopping malls with guns and kill a bunch of people. Well, what if one of those people had control of the U.S. nuclear arsenal or control of the U.S. military? Maybe Putin's a little unhinged. I don't see that so much a psychological assignment. But you have these different international relations theories, right? That say, hey, the realists are saying we push Putin, the defensive realists are saying we push Putin into a corner and he's going to lash out. Maybe now it's too late, right? So now it's like, well, what are we going to do? Roll over and let him take over Europe or take over the Ukraine? Regardless of what we should or shouldn't have done to begin with, he's currently a threat. Other, like I say, offensive realists say, hey, countries are definitely going to kind of dominant. He's dominant. And of course, then there are other forms of warfare that we're seeing emerging, such as kind of hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare is like when you don't exactly go to war. So cyber attacks are an example of this, right? You're not actively out there with a gun shooting somebody. That's called kinetic warfare. But they can be engaging in hybrid warfare through cyber attacks. Maybe gray zone warfare where it's not quite war. So maybe, there was just a natural gas pipeline that was kind of damaged. Maybe that was damaged by Russia to threaten Europe, okay? Maybe some people say Russia invaded the Ukraine to push millions of refugees into Europe to destabilize Europe, because right now you have all these millions of people there that, when you have that big of an infusion of the population, the countries are going to struggle to support it. It's going to lead to conflicts within the countries themselves over how to treat these groups. Then you have rising energy prices, which Russia may have predicted as a result of the war, threatening the economies. When you have economies go down, you have more extremism. Putin's ultimate goal may just be to get the European countries to fight themselves. As I said, we talked about like a lot of the kind of the general things, Russia, China, but you also can be debating about things like conventional force modernization, the development of alliances, which we'll talk about more when we talk about on the con. If we use kind of a alliance, U.S.-Japan alliance to contain China. We've had previous public forum topic debates of whether or not we should station troops abroad. There's nuclear weapons modernization. And there's kind of like this, what's the alternative? The one kind of strange thing I find about this resolution, it says, the United States should pursue a strategy of great power competition. Well, as opposed to what, right? Like, so as opposed to just becoming completely isolationist and like staying home and just letting Russia and China take over the world and hope we can just get what we need all here on the land, like in the United States, and that they don't eventually come to bother us? Does it mean we adopt a policy? Should we adopt a policy of offshore balancing instead, where we have a minimal military footprint abroad and then be like prepared to respond? Does it mean like we should have a multilateral foreign policy, which means we're just working with other countries? Or does it mean that we should try to get to a related world that's more multipolar, where maybe the United States, China, Russia, and maybe potentially emerging India all share power, right? But the negative can't counterplan, but they kind of need to suggest that like maybe there's some alternative that's emerging or could be somehow that would like take, if the United States wasn't a great power, then maybe Russia and China didn't engage in a strategy of great power to competition, then for some reason Russia and China would just kind of agree to divide up their own spheres. Maybe they would. I mean, that's what Henry and Kissinger suggest, right? Russia kind of gets its sphere, China gets its sphere, and U.S. gets its sphere. Who knows? Then maybe Russia and China try to fight each other, right? Because they're kind of control the European, Asian landmass. Maybe they'll fight over different parts of that. Like, who knows what would happen, right? Or how rising India would fit into this. But it's kind of weird to debate it without, well, compared to what? Again, you can kind of talk more on your teams about what that means for you. Let's talk about the con. The con, as I say, is kind of, there's basically two sources of the con, right? And it's kind of an implicit alternative, but I don't know where to go with it. You can also say the pro ideas are kind of criticized by the two theoretical approaches of the con, right? The strategy of kind of a defensive realism, right? Which is articulated by these sources, right? Stephen Walt, John Mersheimer, and Henry Kissinger, which I've already kind of talked about. Basically, projecting power kind of provokes, and by kind of a combination of kind of liberals who say that we should kind of have more multilateral approaches and try to resolve our problems. So let's look at a kind of few of the differences, right? We can have what our core con offense, right, against great power competition is that great power competition is going to create a security dilemma. A security dilemma results when one country's starts to develop kind of military capability to defend itself, but since the other country doesn't know that it's doing it for defensive purposes, they feel threatened by that. You can never know what somebody else's intentions are. In philosophy, you call that the problem of other minds. You don't know exactly what's in somebody else's mind. You can try to ascertain that, but you don't know for sure, right? People debated before Putin attacked the Ukraine what was in his mind, right? And a lot of them turned out to be wrong. But I mean, you can't know for sure, right? But they kind of made arguments based on different things about what his intentions were. But regardless, since we didn't really know what was in his mind, we had to at least have some defensive buildup in the Ukraine. When we had that defensive buildup, maybe Russia interprets that as offensive. You have a cycle. That's called, this creating a security dilemma. Also, the great power rhetoric, competition rhetoric itself, as I said earlier, can lead one country to perceive another as a threat. That's a little bit of constructivism coming in. We see great power conflict collapses international cooperation, maybe things unlike climate change, disease, security in general, other environmental problems, right? There's where you have your liberals coming in. Great power conflict can increase the risk of miscalculated war. A miscalculated war occurs when like one country thinks like the other country attacks it, so maybe it's going to strike first. Or it thinks it has an advantage in striking first. They miscalculate, a big war erupts. An accident is like when a bomb just kind of like goes off by accident, but the situation is tense, so people think that it might be an intentional attack. So, for example, Russia was shooting missiles into the Ukraine when Joe Biden was visiting Poland and he was like 50 miles from the Ukrainian border. Well, what if one of those missiles even honestly accidentally landed in Poland, right? Or near where Biden was speaking? Russia could stand up and yell, it's an accident, it's an accident. We probably wouldn't really believe it. And we may end up in a war with Russia, even if their missile did errantly end up in Poland, because they did strike a target pretty near to the Polish border when Biden was in the Ukraine. It could also cause overstretch, and I'll talk more about this later. But eventually what this means is like, look, if we keep trying to project our power, we're going to exhaust kind of the economic resources that are used to support this military power, resulting in an overstretch and an inability to carry it out anyhow. And we may lose some support, we may lose some resources that we need to put into domestic programs. We also kind of can have a situation of like, some people say that instead of pursuing a strategy of great power competition, if we turn a little bit more inward, then other countries, maybe European countries, will become more autonomous. They will develop some of their own weapons and they will defend themselves. Maybe Japan will get nuclear weapons and defend itself from China, or maybe China will develop more nuclear weapons and create a balance against Japan, or South Korea will get nuclear weapons and balance against North Korea, or Taiwan will get nuclear weapons and balance against China, or Saudi Arabia will get nuclear weapons and like balance against Iran. Right now you have India and Pakistan both with nuclear weapons. Maybe they're balancing against one another. That's the spread of nuclear weapons, more countries getting nuclear weapons. That kind of generally is called nuclear proliferation. And there's a big debate about whether or not the spread of nuclear weapons increases the chance of conflict. Intuitively, it does. But many realists, right, especially like defensive realists, are going to say that kind of creates a balance within the structure, which might prevent the outbreak of conflict and, of course, prevent maybe U.S. military overstretch as well. China, let's look at China first, offense. Well, you can argue that pushing more military resources against China, selling more arms to Taiwan, positioning more arms in Taiwan, floating more aircraft carriers near the South China Sea by the Senkaku Islands, right, and claimed territory by China is going to increase the risk of conflict. Defensively, what are the defensive arguments? So we can talk about, you can kind of make that claim that I attacked earlier, that interdependence makes the risk of conflict unlikely. There's still good debate on that on both sides. Like I said, now it's just a little bit more even than it used to be. You can say that China's actions are defensive, that they don't want to end up in a place like they were before, where Japan invaded them, or potentially the United States invaded them, or part of Taiwan just gets pretend they're their own country in their terms. You can make arguments too that China's military is relatively weak. It's quite large, of a huge population, but there are some people who say that the threat from China is kind of way overblown. Russia con the offense. Well, look, maybe because we projected power too much, we ended up with basically in a proxy war with Russia over the Ukraine. You can say as that kind of conflict expands, or the U.S. projects its power more, that Russia will deepen its military alliance and its with China. The Russia-Iran cooperation. Iran's already been selling Russia drones, which have been used in the Ukraine conflict. They've been trying to buy weapons from South Korea and from North Korea, and some people say they're even employing North Korean soldiers in the war in the Ukraine. And you can kind of take the position, as some people do, that this is largely kind of NATO's fault. In terms of defense, you can, like I say, Russia's military is weak. It's not modern. It doesn't have any chance against the Ukraine. The morale is low. The soldiers are not properly trained. They don't have modern weapons. Short of just like bombing population centers, which you can like kind of largely offset with air defense systems, there's really not much to Russia. And Russia's large military has now been completely exposed. It's basically a big giant joke, relatively speaking. You can attack kind of the idea of kind of offensive realism, that we need to project power. You can say that there's been a lot of criticisms that have been made recently, a lot of books that have been written about how this is kind of based in racism, based in the desire of the West to control the outsiders, that it ignores and tries to women and tries to establish power over their interests. That's kind of basically what's called feminist international relations. Critiques or arguments, securitization I talked about earlier, or just kind of a critique of militarism, that we're trying to constantly project military power. In terms of a con, I'll call it trick. It's just hegemony bad. It's been in debate forever, at least since the early 1990s when I was debating and started coaching. This argument has literally been there every single year. The basic argument is that the U.S. is kind of starting to be military and economically overstretched, which makes our strategy of great power competition an inevitable failure, because we can't sustain it, especially against two great powers, right? And you see all kinds of articles written now about like, well, just should we focus on Russia or should we focus on China? How are we going to focus on both? It's too much. That this great power competition could accelerate the decline, right? could accelerate the decline of the United States by putting more resources into a broad collapsing of strategy. And instead, we should try to husband our resources so we can protect the resources we have and then project power abroad, project power abroad if needed. So there's like a folder within the resources folder here that has all the core hegemony, good, bad debate blocks and all like the best evidence that's been read on the argument over the last few years. Additional broad evidence to debate. You can debate whether NATO is good or bad. I say we can debate about whether European strategic autonomy is good or bad. You can debate whether our alliances are good or bad, right? Like last spring, we had I think it was April topic about Japan developing nuclear weapons, good or bad, right? So you have all those arguments, right? Like about balancing and those types of things. Say maybe it's good to abandon great power competition because then Japan will rely less on the United States, develop its own nuclear arsenal, and that's good. Some of you debated all those arguments. There were debates about whether or not establishing military bases causes environmental pollution, threatens indigenous populations, leads to gender and sexual violence, right? Those were big arguments on those topics, and I'm sure they'll be back again, especially from people who debated them last year. A couple of conceptual thoughts, right? It's generally about Russia or China, but there are all these other issues. We just, some of you debated last year probably just said, wow, I could bring back my old basing good, bad arguments, right? There's secondary issues to draw from, such as alliances and nuclear weapons modernization, and even conventional force modernization. I will kind of repeat that the pro probably has to prove it, right? They got to prove that it's on violence desirable, so presumption is con, even though the pros kind of defending the status quo, which is a little bit strange. But you also kind of, the pro is going to have to win to some degree that it's succeeding or it can succeed. We have all our public forum weighing mechanisms, magnitude, scope, time frame, probability, reversibility. Look, this is huge magnitude. We're talking about great power conflict and great power war, which in the modern era, this is the first time where we probably are really looking, since the Cold War, potential for great power war that could go nuclear, right? And that era was even a little more arguably stable. China hardly had any nuclear weapons at the time, and the U.S. was just dealing with Russia. And we kind of narrowly avoided a couple nuclear wars with Russia, right? Kind of maybe through a little bit of luck. And now we have to manage this across two different powers. One power, Russia, which is probably at least now in decline, given the disastrous war in the Ukraine. Another which is continuing to rise, China. And then you have the U.S. trying to maintain its resources to deal with kind of both of these, right? If you look at this picture, it's not exactly the same, but you have kind of the U.S. kind of stuck in the middle here. Imagine the U.S. is the globe and Russia and China on either side, and we're trying to kind of prevent this from all going kind of awry. So scope to me sounds kind of silly. We're talking about mass death and probably a nuclear holocaust. Like I say, China is probably a pacing threat larger into the future. That's what a lot of people refer to it as. Russia is kind of a more immediate threat. If we're dead, we're not going to reverse this. But there's some ethical objections related to racism and gender in international relations theory. I'll kind of end with just kind of a few additional vocabulary words. One is revisionist, okay? Revisionist means that a power that's kind of seeking to revise, like I say, the current international order, maybe get back some of the territory that they think they wrongly lost over the last 50 to 100 years. If a country is a revisionist power or you have a revisionist leader, then they're a threat that you obviously need some great power competition to deter. Security dilemma, already talked about. Hard power refers to military power. You have economic power, right, that kind of supports the projection of that military power. Soft power is your cultural influence, how much you're liked. Obviously, if you have strong economic power, then you're going to have a lot of kind of cultural influence. Now, these three kind of are considered facets of power that make up and kind of enable what you call hegemonic power, right? Country that dominates economically, militarily, and has a ton of global influence, which all Russia, the United States, and China seek, could become the leader of the world, right? The United States has been that leading power, unipolar power, the number one power, right? Russia, right, 90s, early 2000s, kind of in the gutter. China was rising, but the U.S. was still well above them. Now you have China moving up to kind of challenge the United States, maybe secede it. You have Russia probably following back down as a result of the war in the Ukraine. Retrenchment refers to just kind of pulling back, right, rather than pushing forward. U.S. is pushing forward, right? We're expanding our deployments in Western Europe. We're expanding our support for NATO. We're expanding our support for Taiwan. Our offshore balancing I talked about, right? It's kind of an organized retrenchment where you limit your military footprint abroad, but you're prepared to project power. That's opposed to maybe isolationism, where you just kind of completely turn inward and you don't even try to balance. Bipolar and multipolar I talked about in different parts before, but I want to clarify that bipolar is the two competing powers, right? So we had bipolar world, United States and Russia, right, in the 70s and 80s competing kind of directly against one another. China was out there. Now you had a world that was becoming a little bit multipolar, at least till Russia fell off, but maybe China becoming the unipolar global power. Proliferation, as I said, refers to the spread of nuclear weapons. I'll just drop down to the bottom there. The Non-Proliferation Treaty was designed to prevent that. The CCP is the Chinese Communist Party. They're the ones that are in charge of the PRC, the People's Republic of China, as opposed to the ROC, which is Taiwan. You have NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which many of you debated for September and October and I think January last year. And then tactical nuclear weapons are those smaller nuclear weapons that people are constantly talking about Russia potentially using in the Ukraine. Anyhow, I covered a lot of material. I think that this helps create like a kind of a global, no pun intended, broad understanding of the topic. I think if you can kind of debate these issues and understand them at a broad level, you'll win a lot of debates. There are thousands of pages of updated and downloaded blocks available for our subscribers on the website.